Hey everyone, welcome to Group Text. I think we all know that calling me a fan of true crime is an understatement, and this one is so exciting for me in so many ways because this is a legendary Los Angeles case. On July 1st, 1981, 5 people were found brutally beaten in an apartment off Laurel Canyon in the Hollywood Hills. 4 of them were already dead when the police arrived, including 2 members of the Wonderland Gang, who MO was to steal drugs from rival dealers to sell or use themselves. What followed in the wake of this grisly murder was an investigation so complicated and surprising, it's why we have the saying, truth is stranger than fiction. I'm so excited about this. My guests today are best-selling author Michael Connelly and director Alison and Ellwood, who have created a 4-part docuseries about the case called The Wonderland Massacre and the Secret History of Hollywood, which streams on MGM Plus beginning September 8th. And for those of you who don't know, if you live under a rock, Michael got his start as a crime reporter, and his 39 novels include The Lincoln Lawyer, Resurrection Walk, and The Black Echo, which introduced readers to the homicide detective Harry Bosch. Alison's a PGA and Emmy award-winning nominee who has directed such documentaries as Laurel Canyon, which was amazing, and American High, among many others. Alison and Michael, after that exhausting intro, welcome to Group Text.
Yeah, glad to be here.
I'm a fan of both yours. So, I'm sure at some
That's
point
great.
I will fangirl during this, but we have so much to talk about because growing up in LA, the Wonderland murders, seeing all the amazing footage, for me, it was like my childhood, and doubly so because my mother worked in Vegas. She at one point was doing 30 weeks a year in Vegas. So I actually got to see Liberace. I got to see Scott on stage, but we'll get into all of that. So the Wonderland murders are one of the famous Hollywood crimes, and to say it has a bizarre cast of characters is the understatement. And I summarized the crime, but what can you tell our listeners about who the victims were, who the suspects were, and what led to the murders? And could you do it in 2 sentences or less? No. Explain to people who aren't familiar with it what it originally was.
Alison, you want me to start?
Yeah, you should take this for sure.
Okay, well, I mean, it was a big murder. It was about a decade after the Manson murders, and most of the police officers and detectives who went into that house afterwards said it was the bloodiest crime they've ever seen, possibly in the history of Los Angeles. And so it was a big crime in that way. One of the prosecutors that is part of this documentary, who's now a judge, actually kind of coined it best. He said, when a crime is committed in hell, you don't have angels as witnesses. So this was a group of people that were nefarious and were rip-off kings, all based in Laurel Canyon, which was the center of music and culture for more than a decade that Alison has documented in other films. And so this is kind of like a tombstone at the end of that really glorious time of inspiration and music, the end of an era of innocence, if you will. And so that's why I think it sticks in the kind of the zeitgeist of at least Los Angeles mythology.
Absolutely. Alison, what would you want to add to that? Because you really did take a deep dive in your previous work of Laurel Canyon, and I think Michael just put it so well. It was the tombstone. It was almost like how the Manson murders were the end of an innocence of an area.
Yeah, well, when we started doing this series, I had literally just finished the Laurel Canyon series, and this story seemed like literally the negative image of what we just finished. That it was all darkness, and that's why we sort of took a very noir approach to this.
It's so fun. I don't want to give a lot away, but one of the things that people sort of did, a famous name always jumps out at people. And you had 2 infamous names as part of this murder. John Holmes, who at the time was the most famous porn star, we could say, in the world.
Yeah.
And a man named Scott Thorson, who was Liberace's longtime lover, but started out as his quote unquote, for those who know the term, ward, who had come from a very rough background and got swept up not just into this world of glamour, but this world of excess and the underbelly and the seamy sort of side of the big Hollywood nightlife and of the time in Hollywood, which was, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. What role did those two play in the crime?
Well, they were really important. That was our way in. Scott Thorson, who recently passed away, he's kind of like a Hollywood Zelig. He seems to show up throughout the decades with involvement in good and bad stuff. I mean, the guy was portrayed by Matt Damon in a movie. But this story really connects the underworld, the Hollywood underworld, with the overworld, the world of celebrity and so forth. And the conduit, the through piece, is Scott Thorson. And in that regard, Liberace is kind of, ancillary to that. It's really this documentary really kind of follows Scott Thorson's path. And it's a lot about this crime and about how he was a key witness. He happened to be in the wrong place at the right time and knew all the details of what happened. And therefore, when he finally came forward, many years too late, actually, to say what he knew, he became kind of the star witness. But then his star faded as well, because he also kind of crumbled under the pressure of that. But it's really a story that I think, revolves around a crime. True crime junkies are going to be all over this, but it also has, I think, higher aspirations in saying this is how this connected to almost all levels of society in Los Angeles. And, and it is a pretty tragic history, but it's also, you're leavened by the relentless pursuit of it by detectives that we interview and prosecutors. Prosecutors to this day are still bothered, by the fact that some people got away with murder.
And that's an amazing point, which is it crosses every socioeconomic level that you can find in Los Angeles, from huge stars, and at one point Richard Pryor's name pops up in there, down to crack houses. When you started this, did you, I know you had a working knowledge of the crime, but did you really realize how deep the roots were in the drug culture of Los Angeles?
No, I didn't. I didn't know that this one story could encapsulate all that. I was doing some interviews with Scott, and he mentioned that he introduced, he said it in a kind of a bragging way, that he was the guy who introduced crack cocaine to the Black Guerrilla family, which was a prison gang that when members got out of prison, they became drug dealers. And so, again, it was kind of astounding that this, guy who used to be on the stages of Las Vegas was cooking crack in these 5-gallon jars, and it was spreading all over Los Angeles. And we all know what happened with the crack epidemic in the last, at the end of the 80s, how it really kind of destroyed whole communities and took a huge slash through society in every city. And this is just a story about one city.
Alison, go ahead.
Just what's great also, Michael's not mentioning, is that he was a young reporter then covering another murder that was called Four on the Floor, which, it's just fascinating that, as a young man, you were following something that happened later that ended up being connected to all of this. It's just so wild.
How did you two connect?
Well, Michael had done the podcast with Nick and Jen, and then they decided to do the series, and Nick and Jen contacted me, and then we met with Michael, and we all decided to work together.
So you talk about, which I think is such an interesting term, you liken Scott to an, quote, unreliable narrator that you would include in one of your novels. Could you ever tell... Well, first of all, explain to people what an unreliable narrator is. And did you ever have any inkling, because, you know, from your history, and I was going to say, Alison, with your history in delving into these sort of deep LA topics, could you ever tell when he was telling the truth? Did your radar go off? I mean, and how, because you define unreliable narrator very clearly, and I'm not going to be able to do that.
Well, I mean, it's a device that, I mean, I'm primarily a fiction writer now, but I was a journalist. But in fiction, it's a device where you set up a character and you don't know how far you can trust them, whether they're telling the truth. And Scott has always presented that way. Like, as I said before, he came in as a witness 8 years too late, and it was only because he needed help. And so when you have someone in that kind of underworld echelon, you know, they're very calculated in what they're going to say and what they're going to get in return. And so you always had to kind of treat Scott with kid gloves. And he was very good about like saying stuff like, he said, like, I got put into witness protection. Well, guess what? If you call up the U.S. Marshals and say, hey, was he in witness protection? They're not going to tell you that. So if he's lying, he's telling a lie that he knows is hard to confirm or refute. And so that happened a lot when we were doing the podcast and when we were doing the film. But I have to say, whenever a doubt would come out, you know, it was our duty to try to go around him or find something that would confirm what he's saying. And so we did find the detective who said, I delivered him to witness protection. But if it was just Scott on his own, we would probably be very concerned about, you know, how much of this is self-aggrandizing, how much of this is protecting somebody. You have to kind of weed through all that. And, you know, luckily we had 3 detectives who carried this, actually 4, who carried this case through many years. And they all had different opinions of Scott. But as one of the detectives said, there's a grain of truth in everything that Scott says. You just got to find that grain and work with that.
And Alison, when you're making a documentary, there's so many different choices you can make. Do you have a narrator? Do you have the character that drives the whole story? Do you go no host, so to speak? How did you decide as a filmmaker to let and use, obviously, Michael, who's on a whole different level, especially in this genre, and especially in the fiction genre, be the one to walk us through the story? Because that's a filmmaking decision.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, in the podcast, I loved the cat and mouse game that Michael and Scott were constantly playing, like Michael trying to fish stuff out and Scott hedging and, you know, again, playing with this unreliable narrator. Do you believe him? Is he taking us to a place so you can trust him? So I was fascinated by that. So I wanted to get them in a setting together and to see that cat and mouse. And I think we really captured that in the film. And then we wanted to do all the interviews like that, more verite style, like a scene with, and because Michael has longstanding relationships with these detectives as well, it was great that they could be very conversational with one another. So we wanted it to feel more like scenes with Michael propelling us through the story as the person inspired to tell this story.
Michael, did your old buddies who've known you forever, like, pick up the phone and go, Connelly, what are you doing now? Why what are you up to this week?
There's a little bit of that, but something has happened. I was a journalist for 14 years and I worked for the LA Times, and I wrote about, as Alison said, a case that was connected to this. I actually lived around the corner from the house in Wonderland. And just something has happened to me, and I left journalism and I wrote about 20 books. Something about the story really struck with me, and I think what it is, and we haven't even mentioned them yet, that this has all the classic parts that you need in a really good crime novel. You got to have a really good and cunning villain, and Eddie Nash, who's the guy who's our villain of this piece, is a real guy. He was a real guy, and he was He was interesting as much as he was a violent person, a guy who instigated violence. He just ticked all the boxes of a villain that you would want to have in a book when you could say anything you want. But this was a real person, and we, kept within the guidelines of reality and nonfiction. But it was definitely the story that could draw me out of a couple decades of just writing fiction. Now, in my fiction, I do a lot of reporting, and I think there's a lot of reality in my books. But this was like a really a nice change to go in this direction and go back to my roots as a journalist. And I was so happy that Alison said, "Hey, we want you on camera. We want you to be asking these questions." I'm a bit of an introvert, so it only took me about 5 seconds to say, "Yeah, I'll do that." But I think it worked out pretty good because I do like facing off, or I did like it with Scott and trying to pin him down on things. And at times it was quite fun to do that.
You just brought up Eddie Nash. Again, such a good villain. When you start telling his story in the beginning, one of the things that struck me was it almost seemed like there was never enough power for him. That it went from owning a nightclub to owning a huge, a number of nightclubs, that celebrities were at the nightclub, that then he wanted to start, get a secondary income and another source of power of controlling this by taking the drugs and bringing them in, and then moving up the food chain to the point of literally being, for lack of a better term, a drug lord and a successful and big one. I can't believe I just said successful in Los Angeles, that eventually led to crack. It's what was it about him that there was almost this insatiable drive to keep getting more and more and more power, in a way, in Los Angeles? Because it really did feel like an immigrant story in a very negative, strange way. It could have, his powers could have been used for good. But it really is, strangely, an immigrant story, but super dark.
Yeah, again, that's the secret history of Hollywood. For every, good story, there's a story like this. I mean, it's even more of an immigrant story. Before he had that first club, he had a hot dog stand. So this is a guy who, went from a hot dog stand on Hollywood Boulevard to creating this syndicate and this power structure, and what drove him was probably his beginnings of not having anything and the need to succeed. Along with the money, the power, I mean, were his connections that he was always working. Like, it became such a routine to him that, like, when he's arrested, he starts trying to bribe people in the back of the car on the way to the jail. That's how quickly he would move towards his idea or his ideals about how money talks and money will help me walk. And I think the documentary really illustrates that throughout.
I mean, the fact that he tried to bribe the cops in the courtroom, basically.
Twice he tried to do it.
Twice. And we haven't even mentioned that Tom Lange went on to become very well known for the OJ case. So he seems to have found this weird fate in these famous cases, which is a whole other documentary, in my opinion. Yeah. But how did he have just the gumption to do that? I'm trying to formulate what I'm trying to say is not coming out right. How did he have any idea did Eddie have any idea who was going to bite at the temptation? Or was he just like an equal opportunity throwing money at people, hoping someone will pick up on it? Because it comes out later that the judge in his case ends up being bribed and letting him out after 2 years. So did he just sort of throw it out there and see who would bite? Or was he very calculating in who he made these efforts with?
It sounds to me, from talking to all the people that we spoke to, and especially Mitzi, that if this guy does stuff like this, it's worked in the past for him. And according to the cops, he had to have had so many people on his payroll. So it generally worked for him.
Yeah, I think he got acclimated into this world where people can be bought. And, you know, how many people turned him down? I mean, we know of at least 2 or 3 times that in our thing, but we also know where he got away with it. We also, you know, an ATF agent was bought. And, you know, and they found under his bed during one of the raids, you know, all kinds of documentation from the LAPD that he shouldn't have had, that weren't court papers or anything like that. So, you know, as Alison just said, he did this a lot. And, you know, it's almost like that thing they used to say in boys, like if you ask 20 girls for a date, maybe 1 or 2 will say yes. Well, if you try to bribe 100 cops, maybe you're going to get 3 or 4, you know, that kind of thing. So I just think he was very quick to offer. Best illustration is in the last episode when they finally arrest him on federal charges. Literally, they're driving him to jail, and he offers one of the guys a Porsche. You know,
What
that's
color? Now that was the
yeah,
best. What
yeah,
color?
yeah. I mean, that's business for Eddie Nash as a matter of course.
How did you convince people to talk about this? How did you reach out to all these detectives and all of these witnesses, including Scott? I mean, Scott wanted to do it, I think, because of the publicity. I think this is a man that loves being known.
Yeah.
But with the others, how did you convince them to talk? Because I also think that this is a case that haunts a lot of them.
Yeah, it really does. So I called Scott Thorson a Hollywood Zelig. Well, there's an LAPD Zelig in this named Rick Jackson who retired a few years ago after about 35 years working homicides, and he seems to have known everybody. So, and I've known Rick Jackson since I was a reporter, and I haven't been a reporter in 30 years. But he was a guy who came to me and said, and this is how this all started. Rick Jackson said, I got a call from Scott Thorson, who now goes by the name Jess Marlowe. And this guy I've had associations with on and off for 30 some years, and he's an interesting character. And I think if you talk to him, you might come up with a story. And he was thinking in terms of fiction, you know, that this would inspire a novel. And so I met Scott for the first time through Rick. And he told some of his story, and I know something about this case, and a lot of it's been said before, but there's a lot of new stuff that has not been said in this documentary, and it kind of just went from there. And I think I've built up some goodwill with LAPD detectives through my novels, which I think are centered not only on the procedure and solving, you know, plotting, but also about the character it takes to do this kind of work. And so when I knock on the doors of people like Tom Lang and his partner Souza, you know, they were willing to talk and go on the record. They also have everyone. It's kind of like the same. The criminal people who want to talk have something they want. They're doing it for a reason. Well, Lang and Souza also wanted to set the record straight because of things that happened to them during the course of this case.
I think everyone was haunted that justice wasn't served in this case also, that people did get away with it. And I think Scott was part of his journey in this was a need for redemption.
Yeah, I see that. I don't feel like, as a viewer, I don't feel like he got redemption through this. But what so struck me so with Scott was, first of all, what people learn this is there's a very famous news anchor in LA named Jess Marlowe. And Scott picks this name of Jess Marlowe, and your heart just breaks for the real Jess Marlowe. Like, oh, here we go. So Scott goes into witness protection and then decides, I'm going to go on TV. Like, I feel like, was he just trying to get himself? Like, why would you do that? He is identifiable. Did he just assumed because it was with Pat Robertson that they would protect him if Eddie came after him? You know what I mean? Like, it was such balls to do that.
That's, you know, there's a big silence there because that is very hard to explain. But I think ultimately Scott was motivated by money, by attention, And so when he was placed through witness protection into this world of evangelical communities and so forth, he saw that, he doesn't act like it when he's on the Pat Robertson show, but I think he saw like, this is a money-making operation that can get me to where I want to be in my next step.
He's a character unto himself. Do you think there's, other than the police and the for the most part, the justice side, did you find there was anybody that had any redeeming qualities? Because even the victims did not have a lot of, those were not good people. Was there anyone who you thought to yourself, this is just someone?
I do think Scott was trying. I think, to me, the end of the series is quite moving because, the kid, he was 17 years old when he was groomed by Liberace, who was, 40 years his senior or something. And he had such a tragic background. It's not excusing. And he acknowledges he did terrible things and he was involved with terrible people. But I could imagine a world in which Scott Thorson grows up in different circumstances and doesn't end up where he did.
And this is actually a conversation that I had with my fiance when we were watching it, was he was 17 when he met Liberace. He had been in, he says, 17 foster homes, been put in orphanages, this horrid childhood. For me, when I read between the lines, and he brings up the buzzword now of grooming, which was not a word used back then, it was hard for me to take the step that he was so naive that this was going to happen. To me, he was like, I looked at him like, oh, he was a hustler. And having been in Vegas during those years, granted, only because my mom was there, I wasn't working the streets, and having the privilege of seeing all of these performers at the time from backstage, because that's what all the kids did. We moved in a little pack and saw every show, and remembering the car coming on stage. Even at a young age, they would say he wants to adopt him as his son. And I was a child and we all rolled our eyes then. It's hard to believe that he was that innocent. Now grooming's a big word. Hard to believe, especially in Vegas in those days, that he was that naive and that ignorant, especially because he's clearly very smart.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think he's this complete innocent. I think he knew what was going to happen. And you see that later, that he does have this habit of playing the victim in these situations. Like the thing that got him arrested 8 years after Wonderland murders, and when he finally decided to become a witness because he was just going to be sent to prison for robbery. And as we have this in the film, he said, like, I didn't know what they were going to do. They just asked me to get the door open, because he knocked on a door where a drug dealer who knew him would open the door, and then other people barged in and did awful things, and sexual assault and physical assault and so forth. And he says, I didn't know what they were going to do. Well, I don't believe that for a minute. But that is that's a cyclical thing that I saw him do when things got really questionable about his motives. He claims he didn't know what was going to happen. And I think he knew a lot about what the relationship was going to be when he was 17 years old, just like he knew what was going on when he was making crack, big balls of crack cocaine to distribute around the city.
But he also became an addict too, and that, put him in really bad situations later. And who knows whether he would have become an addict had he not been exposed to Liberace and then Nash, who was also an addict, by the way.
Oh yeah. In general, the whole thing with drug lords not, using the product because it's cutting out of their profits is, I feel like it's a much more, I think that came in with the yuppies, so to speak. So why won't the Wonderland case go away? Why is this every so often it becomes a new fascination, whether it be people basing fiction on it. It's sort of the case that won't go away. Why this endless fascination? Is it because of the time it's set in? Is it because of LA? Or is it just one of those cases that really, truly keeps people up at night?
Well, I think it's a lot of those things, but I mean, it's not just an LA story that people know about Laurel Canyon and its significance to the culture of the 60s and 70s, and to some extent even today. I mean, Laurel Canyon is a known place, and so when you have something, this is like the dark heart of Laurel Canyon. I think that's of interest. I mean, Los Angeles, I know from my books, is of interest around the world, because there's a sense that social waves of social change often have their root here in the West Coast of the country, and so I think there's a natural element to this idea that this place that is so beautiful, of oceans and mountains and deserts, can have something as dark as this happen. And it's the same as the Manson case. It's the same as OJ case. These are things that seem very much to be Los Angeles stories.
Alison, you're very, very well versed, especially in the whole area of Laurel Canyon. When you were doing your original Laurel Canyon, you had to have known about the Wonderland murders. How did you, and all the other things that have gone on in Laurel Canyon through the years, how did you stay so focused on telling a story of, I want to say, innocence, and then pivoting into this, which is sort of, the dark?
Yeah, like I said before, it was just literally, it was the negative side of that original story that I'd first told in the Laurel Canyon music scene. And there were seeds of that happening though then, because cocaine, I always see it as the drugs that those artists were using to expand minds and open themselves up to things. The drugs were now being designed to purely addict them. And that the houses that they once lived in and made music in suddenly became, drug caves, drug dens.
Such a lovely world we live in. What, Michael, what other cases keep you up at night?
Keep me up at night?
From your days as a reporter.
Oh, well, there's a lot of stuff I wrote about, but, remember the Cotton Club case? I wrote about that as a reporter. And again, it was similar to this story where I wrote about ancillary crimes and murders that were then connected up with the famous case, the Cotton Club case. But that's something I'm really, really interested in, and talking to Alison about doing something with. I mean, I hate to say it, but as a crime reporter, I came from Florida, where I was a crime reporter, and I got hired, to the big time in LA. And, I just never went wanting, which is a bad thing to say, that there was always something every day when I went to work, some kind of strange case. But, I wrote a lot of murder stories when I came to Los Angeles. And so I remember a lot of them. A lot of them were ones that didn't really catch fire in the public imagination, and they were kind of one and done type cases. But there's stuff that I still stick with me.
Alison, what are you doing next?
Well, as Michael said, we're hoping to do the Cotton Club story. It's stuck in the 80s still. I'm doing a Culture Club documentary.
Oh, fascinating.
Which is really going to be a lot of fun, I think. We're well into that one. And just on this series, one of the things that I love so much is, Michael says at one point, if he had written this as a novel, it would be too unbelievable.
No one would believe it.
Yeah.
No one would believe it. Well,
classic truth is stranger than fiction story.
Ain't that the truth? The Wonderland Massacre and the Secret History of Hollywood on MGM Plus, beginning September 8th. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great to see you.